Thank you everyone for joining us today. We are delighted to have Michael Krigsman, the founder of CXO Talk, join us today to talk about digital transformation and how chief executives think about digital transformation. So in his role at CXO Talk, Michael spends a lot of time with a wide, diverse group of chief executives from the tech industry, from other industries, and so he brings a unique perspective to the discussion that we've been having all year on digital transformation and a particular look at digital business models. So please join me in welcoming Michael Krigsman.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here on this fine winter day.
All right, so do you want to talk a little bit about CXO Talk and sort of your experience there and what that's sort of taught you?
Sure. So CXO Talk is a web-based video series where it's been going now for about 3 years, and we've done about 170 or so of these lengthy interviews. They're each about 45 minutes in length. And as Patrick said, the interviewees are senior execs, not only CEOs, but including CEOs, but CIOs, chief marketing officers, chief digital officers. And I try to find a broad cross-section of people who can speak about different aspects of digital transformation, digital business. So it's a very broad range and encompasses a very wide array of perspectives. The thing that they all have in common, at least this is my goal. My goal is to speak with people who are literally shaping and changing the world, some part of our world. So hopefully, these are all highly innovative people, and so therefore the lessons that they have to teach us are meaningful, relevant, and important.
Great. So let's dive right into some of those lessons at that high level. What are some of the common themes that you hear from these executives about digital transformation?
I think the most important thing is when we hear the word digital, that implies for many of us technology. But in fact, the subject of these conversations is not about the technology itself, about the mechanics of the technology, but rather what new capabilities does the technology give us? So having this technology, what can we do now going forward that we couldn't do in the past? So for example, if you are a General Electric, just to choose one, and I recently spoke with the Chief Digital Officer of General Electric, a guy named Ganesh Bell, and actually last week I met with GE's Chief Marketing Officer. So in the case of General Electric, historically, they sold big machines. And if we look, and Ganesh Bell is the CDO of their power division. I forget their exact revenue, but it could be like $6 billion. So this is a division, but it's a large organization. So historically, they sold very expensive machinery, turbines, electricity generators, things like that. Well, now what they're doing is they are connecting these machines, and they call them connected machines. So they bring together these machines through the Internet of Things, essentially, and that enables them to aggregate data. So now they've got these connected machines, and they can, as a result, analyze the efficiency of the machines. They can analyze, by looking at this collected, aggregated data, what's going on with these machines, and at that scale, a small efficiency gain of a few percent can translate into very significant dollar savings. So this is an example, just one example, of how the technology to connect machines together enables General Electric to do things that it couldn't do before, namely operate these machines more efficiently and have a different type of relationship with the customer, because now it's not just no machine is an island.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really interesting. So General Electric is an example of a company that seems to get this transformation and is really taking advantage of the opportunities provided by it. When a company, clearly there are companies that are struggling to make this transition. Can you talk a little bit about what it is that GE understands? I mean, obviously they understand the power of the data, and they understand the product potential, but what is it that GE seems to be able to do that some of their competitors may not have succeeded at doing?
So I think the companies, whether GE or others, who are successfully making a digital transformation, recognize that the largest shift is, you could say, is a cultural shift. And the reason I say this is because, again, the focus is not on the underlying technology. The focus is, what does this do for your company? And this does new things for your company. And so just to continue with the example of GE, by aggregating this data and getting a better understanding of what the machines are doing in the customer environment, really down to a precise level, it enables GE to have a different type of relationship with the customer, because they can then feed this information back to the customer. But not only that, they can now have a very different business model, economic model with the customer. So instead of selling this machine for $5 million, say, they can promise the customer certain types of outcomes. In their case, cost savings or efficiency, as I said before. And so it changes the relationship with the customer. Now, this requires a mindset shift, because we're no longer in the business of just making these machines. We're now really in the business of making our customers more efficient and looking at it from the point of view of the customer. Does this make sense when I talk about a mindset shift? Head's nodding. Good. So this is really the key thing. It's the and when you talk to chief digital officers, I recently, last week, I moderated a panel of media chief digital officers for large media companies. And the common thread was the difficult part is getting the organization to wrap its mind around these changes. Yeah. We can't do things the old way because the competitive environment has changed. The technology has enabled all these new things. We can't do it the old way. That means we have to do it a new way, and that's hard. And that's where the culture change comes into play.
And it's interesting. So the customer centricity and the customer focus sort of parallels the user focus and within the actual tech world, right? If you talk to a lot of consumer-facing tech, they're saying the same things about their users as enterprises are about their customers. That focus on user experience, and customer centricity, doesn't that also increase the expectations then of those customers or users at the same time?
I think that those expectations have already changed.
You think? Okay.
So our cultural societal expectations of companies with which we do business have changed. We're used to now reaching out to one another on Twitter, on Facebook. We expect instant responses from one another. It's no longer, we don't want to wait for 30 minutes for somebody to get back to us on email or a few hours. We expect instant responsiveness. Yeah. And that set of expectations translates onto what we expect from the companies that we do business with. So for example, I'm a Comcast customer, and there's this account called Comcast Cares. Anybody heard of it? Started by a guy named Frank Eliason. So it turns out that Comcast Cares has special powers that the Comcast call center doesn't have. And so as a consumer, I expect that I can if I have a problem, I want to reach out to Comcast Cares, and if they don't respond in 15 minutes, I get annoyed. So I think the expectations of consumers have changed, which then forces these companies, the brands, to change themselves in response to that, which then reinforces the fact of consumer expectations having changed. And it's a cycle.
Now it seems though, when we think about that cycle, it seems there is a potential of a treadmill that you never quite catch up. Are we headed in that direction, or do you think that there are one of the common concerns with a company like Amazon is that they're promising a level of expertise and service, for example, free shipping on everything, same day, next day service, that most competitors can't match without just harming themselves. Does that have a negative effect on competition? Is that an unattainable future that we're never going to quite see, or?
Well, it's such an interesting question, because if we look at it, rather than saying, is it a difficult or a negative treadmill that we're on, you can look at it the other way, and you can say that this is spurring companies to be increasingly more competitive, and to do a better job, and to innovate around being responsive to their customers. And so from Amazon's point of view, this same-day delivery is an innovation in distribution, and is specifically designed to, number one, be responsive to customers, but very importantly to number two, to present a barrier to competition, just like Amazon Prime.
Yep. So you know, in the Amazon case, they're sort of building out their ecosystem, right? They're trying to look at adjacent possibilities and to take advantage of either deficiencies from competitors in those spaces. You know, do you see that building out of ecosystems being a part of the future for a lot of companies when it comes to digital?
Yeah, it's a really good point. The question of ecosystems has to do with the connection and the partnership that a company has with its customers and with other vendor partners or brand partners. And the power that digital gives us, or the power arises from this connection, from the fact that we are now connected. So we have, in the case of GE, going back to them, they have connected machines, and they aggregate data, and they can see what's going on across their customers. So this connection, whether it's a consumer brand that is connected to its customers on Facebook or Twitter or what have you, or it's an industrial brand like GE that's connected through connected machines, it's the connectivity which is, and this network effect that sometimes you'll hear that phrase, which is an important critical foundation of one of the fundamental changes that's going on as a result of digital. So it's all about the data. So connection, you could make the argument that connection equals data. What is connection, okay? We are talking now, so we have a connection. So there's a communication that's taking place. If that communication is happening between machines, there's a connection. If that communication is happening between you and the supplier, the creator of an app on the iPhone, there's a connection that is being created. There's data that's being exchanged, and Apple, as the sort of overlord of their ecosystem, is benefiting, and presumably they're using that data in two ways. They're using it, number one, to benefit themselves, but of course, because Apple, at least in their own PR, is an enlightened set of leaders, or even leaders is the wrong term, an enlightened set of, say, organizers or coordinators. But what they're really doing is they're using that data to benefit themselves. But the enlightened aspect, quote unquote, enlightened aspect, is they're making your lives easier by helping you make the right kind of recommendations and getting you software that you like.
Mm-hmm. So in many cases, there are new firms that are stepping into existing spaces and causing quite a bit of, I think that the overused term is disruption, right? So this idea of disruption. And they're stepping into ecosystems and filling some sort of customer need. A good example of this, we are in just a few weeks going to have a few financial services executives here, and Venmo is a company that, how many in the audience use Venmo? I love doing this. Everyone, right? As y'all know, Venmo easily to transfer funds back and forth between individuals. Now, Venmo basically sits on top of an existing ecosystem from the financial services sector. If I send you money, Venmo, it's via Venmo. That's my user experience. Bank of America or Citi or Chase have lost that capability. New firms seem to be able to do that better than Bank of America. Is it come back to the culture argument, or what is it that allows them to do that?
It's a really another great question. So the culture is definitely a part of it, but if we take a step backwards, the real difference is the change in business model and the difficulty in adapting to that change, which relates to the culture question. So a traditional bank makes its money in certain ways. They have very established processes for interacting with customers. And the challenge for an existing bank, or really for an existing company, is to operate their ongoing business, and especially if it's a public company where the market expects quarterly results. So the challenge is, how can you operate your existing business, but at the same time being aware that you have competitors that are not tied to an existing business, and so they don't have that baggage. And so for a new company that's starting up, if you think about Uber, that's the one everybody uses. It's kind of a tired example, but it's such a good one. If you think about a company like Uber, that when it started, it was new. It had no existing business model. It had no corporate cultural baggage. Well, we're going to do things this way, either psychological baggage among the people working there, or financial baggage that we have to do things this way because we have to have these ongoing quarterly results. So yes, it becomes much easier for a new company to start up with a new business model than it is for an established company that has to manage both the new business model and the old business model simultaneously under one roof. For established companies, this is one of the hardest things.
So data is obviously sort of one of the big common themes that runs throughout any discussion of digital transformation, and you've given some great examples of that. One of the sort of new emerging business models is that data itself is a business. Can you talk about that, what that really means, and sort of discuss a little bit more about data as a business?
So the question of data actually translates to what kind of data, and then very importantly, what are we going to do with this data? So if we collect data, how is that data going to be useful to us? And how will that enable us to offer new types of products and services? So for example, there's a company called Medidata Technologies, I believe. And I was recently talking with their chief operating officer, who was formerly the CIO of ADP, the really large payroll processing company. So it's an interesting story. So Medidata they automate clinical trials for drugs. And the core of their business historically was and is basically gathering the data that you need for clinical trials. It turns out it's very complicated, and there's a lot of data that has to be collected, and it's very regulated, and so forth. So eventually what happened was they realized that as they're gathering this data, they can aggregate, using the right type of analytics and machine learning, they can start to aggregate what's happening across multiple customers. And so just as GE aggregates data across machines, Medidata aggregates data across clinical trials. Now, the value of this is, and it's anonymized data. Of course, there's, as we know, there's HIPAA and there's all kinds of regulations around healthcare data. So what this means is, because they've got this kind of bird's eye view across many, many clinical trials, they can pick out, and sometimes you hear the phrase signal and noise, they can pick out these weak signals. They can detect these weak signals that may indicate that a drug trial is going well, meaning that this thing is going so well that we should, you're all familiar with the concept of the double-blind study where half the population is given a placebo. So if it's going really well, maybe what we should do is give everybody the real drug so those sick patients who are getting the placebo can actually gain the benefit, because this is a really good thing. On the other hand, maybe it's not going well and we should just end this trial right away because this is not going to be an effective drug. And if they can do this by having an early warning system as a result of this aggregated data, that's hugely valuable to their customer, and then of course to them as a company, it's hugely valuable as well.
It's a fascinating case. I think one of the things that's as we've explored the topic across the year, becoming really clear, very little of the technology underlying these transformations at this point is new. And so there's a lot of just application of existing technological solutions and capabilities that grow incrementally. One of the things that we're trying to understand is, are there new technologies that are going to enable business models, or is this primarily going to be driven by sort of the technology that already coming up with new ways to use existing technology?
Well,
both.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as far as the technology goes, one of the key things that's happening is we're getting better and better at the large-scale aggregation of data. So as you're collecting this data, so we've been collecting data in databases, relational databases, for many, many years, but relational databases are not necessarily the best, most efficient way to aggregate very large amount. I mean, think about Facebook, the amount of data that Facebook is generating all the time. So part of their innovation is how are they storing that data? How are they using and analyzing that data? It's the same thing. Google did the same thing as they were building up their infrastructure. They had to develop new forms, new ways of storing data and distributing these search queries across many, many, many computers so that it's reliable and it's extremely fast. As far as new technologies goes, one thing that's really interesting is virtual reality. I mean, there's many new technologies, but virtual reality, I think, is one of the ones that is going to have a really important impact on consumers and in the enterprise as well. But that technology is just at the starting point.
Yeah, it's one of the questions is how soon. I know we've certainly this year has been a big year for virtual reality with the release of the Oculus and HTC headsets and sort of the push there. But it still seems very early on.
Well, it's a toy. Today it's a toy.
It's a toy, yeah. So.
Look in 5 years. Be very interesting to see.
Yeah. What's
going on with virtual reality in 5 years.
So the skill sets that are required to be successful are changing. And we talked about culture, we talked about talent. We are sitting in front of an audience of MBA students. What sort of skill sets are needed, regardless of role per se, maybe for business leaders in the future? How is that changing?
I think that in the past, business success, one of the important aspects of business success was the ability to create processes and follow those processes, and then make sure that those processes were stable and predictable. And corporations are basically the function of a corporation. You could argue the function of a corporation is to engender stability, process stability, so that you have predictable results. And certainly if you're on Wall Street, that's the case. And so the cultural attribute that led to success in that kind of environment was the ability to be predictable. Today, and I'm not knocking predictability in any way, don't get me wrong, but today, with the environment changing so rapidly, companies are undergoing this very significant transition. And this is not going to be done in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. This is a 10, 15, maybe a 20-year cycle, I believe, that we're currently in. And so, and the reason I say this is, again, I keep going back to GE because it's just such a good example that has such a stable revenue stream. They are having to maintain this huge multi-billion-dollar stable revenue stream while they're changing. It's not going to happen overnight. And so this means that a fundamentally important skill is the ability for us to be adaptable, to recognize that being agile, that being responsive to customers in new ways needs to be the center of our world. And so we need to prioritize responsiveness and agility over process stability. In other words, to say it really simply, it's not sufficient to say that, well, we do it this way because that's the way we've always done it. That's the path in today's world to failure.
So we talked, a little bit about this before you came up, but there's a lot of transformation that's happening within the companies that are leading, and that transition from sort of traditional models of looking at your business and process orientation. And we talked a little bit about this change in the Fortune 500 and how many companies are just not there that were in the Fortune 500, just a few years ago. Do you see that sort of coming to a head and further kind of is change the new, it's a cliche, but sort of change being the new constant, or are we going to reach a point where that again levels out a little bit?
Well, eventually we'll reach a point where it levels out, but not for years, because every company is going to be touched by digital transformation, virtually every company. And if that transition is a 10 to 20 year transition, then that means that we have 10 or 20 years before we reach a point of broad stasis.
So
can I just say, this issue of change is really hard for companies to get a handle on. I mean, this is, if you are a manager inside a company and you are responsible for delivering quarterly results, all of this disruption, I mean, what you see around you is you see your competitors and you may see your margins eroding, depends on the industry that you're in, and your customers want something different from you. And Wall Street expects you to keep delivering the same results quarter after quarter after quarter, and growing and improving all the time.
Can I ask a question about that? So what do you think about all this talk about Apple right now, which it's the first time that they haven't exceeded their goals in 13 years, which they couldn't just grow forever and ever and ever. So I don't know, what do you think?
It's funny, we were talking about that, such an interesting question. So personally, I think there's two things. Number one is Apple sold a god-darn lot of iPhones. So once you've sold the iPhones, how do you get people to upgrade on a mass scale? I mean, of course, the early adopters will line up and they'll just buy anything, right? The latest thing. I'm in that camp. I like to have the latest thing. All right, but how many people are willing to do that? And even for me, it's becoming less of a priority. So that's the first issue. So you have to have something very compelling to drive further sales. But even more importantly than that, in my view, is where's Steve Jobs? Because Steve Jobs was the person who could read the future and who knew that such and such a product would touch, the heart of society, culture around the world. And there is no Steve Jobs at Apple anymore.
So it's really interesting.
Tim Cook is a manufacturing guy, supply chain guy.
Yeah.
Really efficient manufacturing.
It's an interesting switch, though, because I think historically, for the last number of years, hardware has really driven a lot of the innovations, and at this point, software has really risen to become, the dominant force in digital technology. Is there a place for a premium product like Apple in a world where the value is from the software?
The software. So I just got this Huawei phone. And unfortunately, I got it like 3 days ago. It was given to me. I met with people from Huawei, and I dropped it, so the screen is broken. It's like after 2 days. And I really like it because it's fast. The phone is fast. It's very fluid. But at the same time, I was just thinking to myself, I haven't dropped my iPhone in the same way to break the screen. And so there's something really nice about the hardware of the iPhone. I mean, you can just tell the level of design effort that they've put into it. And so I think there is a place for hardware. However, the interface, the way that we experience and interact with that device is through software. Right. And one thing we haven't really spoken about is user experience. Yeah. And so maybe we should talk about that.
Let's talk user experience. We have certainly explored that this year a little bit, but there is this focus on user experience, and sort of again it gets back to the Amazon that's customer expectations are now high for user experience. What potential is there for businesses to innovate, and then where are some of the pitfalls?
So we spoke a little bit about this point earlier, where we spoke about this notion of the competitive treadmill, in a sense. And in fact, the quest for improving user experience is an endless, infinite quest, because it can always be better. But it's tempting to think about user experience as being just the buttons that we press on the software and the way the icons look. But in fact, we should take a broader view of user experience and think about it as all of the interactions that a consumer has with our company. And by the way, this is equally true whether it's a business-to-business company like GE or it's a business-to-consumer company like Apple or Samsung. So if we look at it this way, then what we must do, and by the way, here's where all the pieces kind of come together. So if we look at it this way, then we need to think, okay, so if user experience is a primary goal, and user experience is another way of saying customer satisfaction. It's a more sophisticated way of saying customer satisfaction. So if that's our primary reference point, what does that mean for how we need to organize our company? So for example, if you call a call center and the person has to put you on hold because they need to find out, from some other department about your order status. That tells us right away that there are silos inside that company, and probably silos with their systems as well. So from a user experience standpoint, from a customer standpoint, because it ends up being very, very, very similar there, it means redesigning how we think about customer service. And then if there's feedback that comes in through customer service, what does that mean for product development? And then we have to recognize that customers, we don't control what you sometimes hear the phrase, the customer journey. It used to be that there's this concept of a customer funnel, and we identified, we specified, okay, the customer's going to do this, and we're going to give them this information, and now they're going to do that, and we'll give them that information, and we're going to lead them from kind of general awareness through this funnel to actually buying from us. Well, nowadays, that concept is out the window. Because if you want to buy a phone, you're going to talk to your friends, you're going to look online, in every way. There's as much information out there about the product and the company, maybe even more information than you can get from the company, because the people out there who are using the product know more than many of the people working inside the company itself. And so this notion of user experience actually means taking a holistic view, putting the customer at the center, and then figuring out what do we have to do to change, which then brings in this whole notion of the culture, of the willingness, the ability for a company to be adaptable. And then, and I'm sort of bundling these all together because it's all connected, and then it raises the question of, okay, well, we know we need to eliminate these silos in order to provide the best experience for our customers, but these silos help us generate our current revenue. Yeah. Our business model today is based on delivering this stuff day in, day out, without a slip up. And this is now going to change. And so what do we do with the fact that we now have to have this existing way of delivering products, but we also want to do this on-demand delivery of products like Amazon is doing, which requires a completely different set of processes. And now we need to do both simultaneously, and we can't screw up either one. So now where we were running one business, in fact, we're running two businesses under one roof.
Yeah. And that seems to be one of the kind of brings it all together. You know, we talked about those three characteristics to sort of successfully transition to being a digital business in today's world. You know, you and I have had this conversation a few times, right? The idea of experimenting with new business models, the recognition of culture, and then the sort of the management of multiple businesses, sort of bringing this all together. Are there any other sort of traits that you see that are going to be critical beyond those?
There is also the people trait. So as you're doing all of this, there is this other dimension that we haven't spoken about, which is, do our existing people have the skills that are needed to operate these new business models? Because it's based on technology. So it means that we need to have a group of people who are technologists, but let's call them modern technologists, who are not just, in the old days, programmers working at a bank, what they did, I see people nodding, is they programmed, you know, the transaction systems. And there wasn't much of a user interface, because who really cared about the user interface? Because after all, if you work at the bank and you want to use our systems, you're going to use our user interface. And if you don't like our interface, go elsewhere. Oh, and by the way, it's the same every place else too. So it really didn't make any difference. Nowadays, where you are trying to be customer-centric, and the applications that used to be in-house facing applications, like funds transfer, for example, are now outward-facing applications, it means you need the right people. And finding the right people is, and if you're an existing organization, helping your established staff transition is definitely a key issue.
Let's turn it over to the students. Questions? Yes.
So one of the biggest issues I see frequently is the mentality of people in leadership positions kind of considering the use of technology or digital ventures as this kind of like other thing, right? Like we've got our core business, and then we've got like our digital team and our tech team that's kind of taking care of that stuff.
Yes.
And that like lack of cohesiveness is, I think, one of the biggest issues. And I'm curious to know, in speaking with like leaders and executives, what are some of the traits that you see as being most frequently used when overcoming that kind of hurdle, right? Is it like vision? Is it knowledge? Is it opportunity to learn? I mean, so what's the biggest answer to fix that problem?
Oh, the biggest answer is really simple, and it comes down to having your back against the wall with no choice, because you're going to die if you don't change, metaphorically speaking, of course. So
Yeah.
I mean, when you have no choice, then you change. So last week when I was talking with these media executives, one of the things they said was these guys were and women were CDOs of these really large media companies, and some of them have been in media for a very long time. And so they said initially when they became CDO, they were sort of exactly as you described, sort of these people off to the side. And then eventually what happened is the company and the CEO realized, oh, that this thing that's off to the side is now actually central to our business. And then a funny thing happened. There was then a tendency for the CEO to say to these folks, oh, well, this digital thing is really too important for you guys, even though because it was now central to the business. So when there is so I was being tongue-in-cheek before, obviously, but actually no, because when there is no choice, then you change.
So are you also saying that the only companies that do it well are the ones that are forced to do it?
It's an interesting question. No, I mean, that can't be true. But I would say that, again, there are, I am sure that out there are companies that, and maybe GE is an example of this. There are companies, the American Cancer Society has been adopting digital in a big way. And they had the vision to do that and to make an orderly transition. So I think you have to look at the industry. The media industry is an industry where change was forced upon them very quickly. And so they had no choice. But in general, people don't change. People inside companies don't change unless most people, and broadly company strategies, tend not to change unless there's some forcing function. Maybe it's not right at their throat today, but they see that if they don't change, it will be sometime in the future.
Yeah, sure. So thinking about new technologies that are emerging, so how do you, when you have the discussions, how do executives think about when to make that investment and it's going to provide a competitive advantage? So for example, QR codes, RFID, they're 15 years ago now, but for a while that was on a hype cycle, that's what you had needed to make that investment in. And probably they didn't pan out to the extent that that investment was valid. But right now, looking at augmented reality, virtual reality, beacon technology, how do you kind of make that decision point of, hey, this is going to be worth the investment and the payoff, versus let me wait a little bit and see what happens in the market, and now I'm too late?
It's a good question. So the question is, it really comes, it's an innovation question, actually. It's a question around how do you innovate and what is the pace of innovation and then the adoption of innovations that you develop. And I think for most companies, they undergo some type of experimentation. You know, we try things out. And this, I'm sure you've all heard the phrase iterative or agile development as opposed to traditional waterfall development of software. And really, the notion here is historically we would have these enormous projects and we would, invest all kinds of money, and really we were taking a huge bet. And the appetite today is to take fewer of these very large bets and to try things out. And you hear the term, which I don't like, failing fast, which I don't like the term because it's really not about failing fast. It's about trying small experiments that are small enough that you can do it quickly, see what the result is, see if it goes well, and then make a course correction based on that, and to do that on a repeating or iterative basis. And so I think a lot of companies sort of look at it this way. But don't rule out things like RFID. Kroger, for example, I spoke with the CIO of Kroger, and RFID is very, very important for them. It may take a longer time than one thinks, for the technology to proliferate at scale.
Yeah, that seems to be one of the challenges, is that certain technologies, the time horizon from the tech industry's perspective on a product versus a traditional industry are very different. We saw this with Samsung's trying to introduce refrigerators that were smart refrigerators, right? Like, people don't buy a new refrigerator just because there's a new refrigerator available. They go out and they wait 10 years when they need their new refrigerator. How much is the tech industry impacting those time horizons, or are consumers going to kind of stand by?
Well, from the tech industry perspective, the best change is fast change because of upgrades, right? So the tech industry wants consumers and wants businesses. And if you look at software marketing, I work with a bunch of large enterprise software companies. If you look at their marketing, it's all about, well, we have this new feature that's going to make your business, much better in some important way. And that's how they sell. The other thing is the whole mentality of the tech industry is driven ultimately by product and by development. And people developing products, it's all about the next thing. Because if they're not developing the next thing, they don't have jobs. And besides, that's what they like to do. That's why they're there in the first place.
Across the course of 170 interviews, what are the companies that those executives point at and say, we're changing, we're adapting, we're trying to grow our business to be more like those guys? Are there a top, a couple companies that come up a lot?
Well, Amazon, Uber, Apple, these are the these are the ones that these are the cliche companies that everybody talks about. But there's a lot more out there. But it's just very easy to point to those because they've grown so quickly. I mean, look at Uber. It's like a multi-billion-dollar company.
Other questions?
So in our marketing and the network economy class, we were also talking yesterday about how the way Wall Street measures sort of company performance needs to change to allow these companies to innovate and to change. But assuming they don't change, at least in the short term, how should companies manage sort of that trade-off with their financial performance versus actually innovating and changing?
Yeah, well, this is that simultaneous business model question that I was talking about earlier, and this is really one of the most difficult things. And when I talk with CEOs, this is an issue that comes up. You know, it's tough because the senior management is trying to drive. Senior management is in a sense giving a schizophrenic message. Message number one is stability. Okay, we have to maintain our revenue, we have to satisfy our customers, do what we do and be the best at it. Message number two is the world is changing around us, we need to change, we need to adapt. And to some extent, these are mutually exclusive, and that's why if you look for example, at the technology industry, it's been very, very difficult for established software companies, large software companies, to shift from on-premise to cloud. And it's very much for this reason, because you as the CEO may announce, we are the innovation company. And I've seen large companies do this. We are the innovation company, we're the easy company. And in reality, the people working in your company, they're not the innovation company, and your product is really is complicated and complex. So simply making a pronouncement that that's the case is nice as a broad statement of goal, but then you have to get down to the nuts and bolts. So for example, how do you compensate your salespeople? Just as an example. And in the case of software, where it's on premise, those salespeople were compensated by selling, the elephant hunting, as sometimes you hear the phrase. They sell a big project, and now they get their commission fee, and that's it. Everybody's happy. Well, they're happy. The salesperson's happy. In this new model, where, say, the cloud, where the sales model is subscription-based, you don't make a killing up front. It happens over a period of time. And convincing these folks that, going to a salesperson and saying, yeah, you used to make these big commission checks and it would be really great, but now you're going to make less money up front, but over the lifetime of this customer, you're going to make more. And so you really have to make sure that the customer is happy. And the salesperson is saying, why would I want to do this? And so there's this notion of antibodies, anti-innovation antibodies that exist that kind of look at these changes and say, no, not here, not on my watch, because that's not good for me.
Great. Any last questions? Well, Michael, we want to thank you for joining us today. It's been an enlightening conversation. Really appreciate you spending the time with us today.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank everybody.
Thank you. It was fun.